All right, welcome back to the second part of this topic. And so here, as I said, we're going to kind of pull out the principles of learning and how the principles of learning might be influential in helping us to understand the effectiveness of training. So we're going to break it up a little bit and talk about the learning context in three parts: the way that the training itself is designed, the basic principles of learning that might influence the effectiveness, and then the characteristics of the trainee or the trainer that might be influencing this effectiveness. So we learning can be cognitive, psychomotor, social. In other words, the way the training is designed ought to be related to the KSAs in the job analysis. We'll talk about providing feedback, employing, let's see here, trainings, goals, etc. Okay. Learning by definition is a relatively permanent change in behavior that occurs as a result of experience or practice. Okay, so it's relatively permanent change in behavior. Long story, but learning is a hypothetical construct, just like everything. Give me 5 cups of learning. We can't get 5 cups of learning. Instead, we could infer that learning has occurred. How do you know that learning has occurred? Because there is a change in behavior. However, what we're going to find is that learning is intimately tied to motivation, and motivation is in a completely different topic. I think it might even be the next topic, but it's a completely different topic. But what we find is that you can't really understand the principles of learning without motivation, because we infer that learning has occurred because a change in behavior has occurred. But here's the thing. Just because I have learned how to do something, if I'm not motivated to do so, I won't do it. Okay? And so you infer learning based on changes in behavior, but changes in behavior can be absent simply because a person is not motivated. So clearly we need to keep that thought in mind, that though we're talking about training in this topic as though it's somehow separate, it's intimately tied into the motivation idea. In learning research, it has been shown that active learning is much more effective than passive learning. In certain things like Craig and Larkhart's levels of processing theory, they said they did this really classic study where they had people they went through, they didn't tell them they were going to memorize words. Instead, they went through like 25 words, and the first one group was like, is this word start with a capital letter? Something like that. And so people just went through a list of words and they analyzed whether or not there was a capital letter in the front. And then the second level of processing was like, does this word rhyme with bear? And the word was chair or something like that. And then so they go yes or no based on whether or not it rhymes with something else. So that was the second level of processing, or depth of processing. And in the most active level, or they call the deepest level of processing, but the most active form of learning was one where they said, okay, I want you to imagine this word in relation to something in your life. And so you now had to process the word at a really deep level. And so, as I said, Craig and Lockhart referred to this as levels of processing, and they called it deep processing. But it's really the difference between active learning and passive learning. Okay? Some other interesting work that has come out, and this is work that comes all the way from Herman Ebbinghaus's original learning curves from the 1850s. I mean, fundamentally, this is where this comes from. And that is the difference between the effectiveness of massed practice and distributed practice. And it turns out, as a rule, that massed practice is less effective than distributed practice. What's the difference here? Let's say we refer to the way you study for an exam. You could either distribute your practice and study 1 hour a day for 8 days, or mass your practice and study 8 hours on one day. Well, distributed practice is by far more effective than mass practice. It's just without a doubt it's more effective, especially if you want to have long-term retention. Now, if you want to memorize something to take an exam in the morning, an 8-hour study jam session might be effective to get the answer tomorrow, okay? But if you really want to have long-term retention, long-term behavioral change, distributed practice is by far the most effective. But the problem is that you have to have rest periods in between, and It may not be practical for an organization to say, okay, each and every trainee comes in for 1 hour a day for 8 days in a row. It's like, no, I hired a dude. I need him on the line 3 days from now. I need him right now. So if it's a low complexity task, distributed practice works very well. But you find it is better, but we got to take the principles of learning and the practicalities of the organization. And it turns out that if you've got a highly organized, coherent task, what happens is you should train the entire thing at one time. So a bunch of steps would integrate to each other. But if you have a complex task that is really a series of step one, complete this job, close a book on it, step two, do this job, close a book on it. If you have this kind of a complex task with subcomponents, then what you should do is train each subcomponent completely and utterly until it's mastered. Teach the first one until it's mastered, second one until it's mastered, and go on from there. Meaningfulness of material. Yeah, it turns out that material that is present, and again, this is Herman Ebbinghouse's basic findings. Nonsense material is not well retained. Okay, more meaningful material is much better retained. In fact, one of the basic principles of memory is if you want to remember something better, make it relevant to you, because human beings are selfish creatures. We have a far better memory of events that relate to ourselves. And so, I mean, they've done these studies where they're like, have people memorize a list of words, or another one that says, what I want you to do is imagine yourself interacting with this object. And I was like, duh, that just personal memories. And so, in this way, the more you can make the material meaningful to the trainee, or relevant to their job, or relevant to their lives, okay? Meaningful material should be presented in such a way that there's an overview. An overview, I have always found to be a critically important thing. In fact, what I try to do on the first day of my classes, I always have a syllabus overview, and of course I go through what are the grading principles and how do you get an A and things like this. But one of the things I try to do is go over the structure of all of the chapters in the course and how they relate to each other to create to give the trainees, right, give the students an idea where things are related to each other. And it's very important to put material in a logical order. Okay? And most textbooks do a pretty good job of presenting material chapter by chapter in such a way that is logical, but still, it is our job as the trainer or professor here to make sure that students see the connections between the material, okay? That they do not see each separate component as somehow isolated from other components. Okay? Overlearning, and again, oh my God, this is Herman Ebbinghaus, okay? Overlearning, that is, even once you have learned the material, you learn it and you practice it and you practice it and you practice it and you practice it. And basically what happens with overlearning is overlearning leads to automaticity. When you first learn a skill, it takes a lot of cognitive processes to make it happen. Like when you're first learning to drive a car, it took almost all of your attentional resources to focus on, how to, oh my God, I still remember how stressful it was. I thought I was going to hit the mirror on the car. It's parked by the side of the road, etc. But the more you practice and the more you practice, the more parts of the procedure become automatized. And automatic, what it means is that skills that have been automatized require literally fewer neural connections to make it happen. And so those aspects of the skill that are automatized take zero attentional resources in order for us to understand them. And so this frees up attentional resources for other aspects of the problem. But overlearning and automaticity can be problematic in that sometimes it can lead to carelessness. And so sometimes people that have worked for a long time with dangerous equipment, it's become so automatized to them that they don't stop and even think and realize that, oh yeah, this thing could cut my arm off. All right. And so sometimes automaticity can lead to carelessness. Feedback, yeah, feedback is critically important, both positive and negative if implemented correctly. But feedback needs to be timely. And this is, again, this is simply a basic principle of learning. If you would like to employ a reinforcer or a punisher, which is literally what feedback is a reinforcement or a punishment, kind of, you know. But what it is if you want a reinforcement or a punishment to be effective, it needs to be applied immediately after the behavior has occurred. Okay. So, you know, in the old Leave It to Beaver episodes or some of these older 1950s shows, you know, where they show the traditional nuclear family and, you know, the kid is naughty and the mom says, you just wait till your father gets home. You know, that's the worst possible thing. You just don't have a delay between the behavior and the consequence of that behavior. So the faster the feedback, the more effective it becomes. I know how much students hate delayed feedback, and I'm projecting now. Here it is, January, and I'm projecting out to whenever this, I don't know when this thing will be, you know, listened to. But I'm projecting it out there. I'm really fast at feedback for a very specific reason because I think students both appreciate it, and I think immediate or relatively quick feedback is, in fact, the best for performance changes. Feedback allows for adjustments. I mean, how do you fix it if you don't know what's wrong, right? Feedback can make learning more interesting and increase motivation. It can lead to goal settings. It can improve performance. So clearly, feedback has got some real interesting uses. But you know what? There's some interesting points here. I'm going to take this feedback and move it right into individual difference of trainees, right? Those people being trained, some of them, they just they don't give a shit. I'm sorry, they don't care. And so you give them feedback and they're like, "Pfft," and blow it off. So if the trainees are not of the attitude to accept feedback, well, then it doesn't matter what kind of feedback you use. All right, so it's irrelevant. Okay. So what other kind of differences between trainees' readiness? Clearly, learning only happens. And this is like Vygotsky's ZPD, zone of proximal development. The basic idea that you need to evaluate what your trainee is capable of. Because if you're trying to implement training that is beyond their level, it will be like the teacher on the Peanuts cartoons, the Snoopy cartoons. Wah, 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 wah. You know, it doesn't mean anything. So you have to take your trainee, look at them, and look at what stage are they at, and make positive that you do not put training at a level that is beyond their ability. Okay, you're just wasting time. Motivation, that's kind of what I just said. Motivation, not just motivation to learn, but motivation to accept feedback. Okay, and there's just no two ways about it. Some employees and some students just aren't motivated. I'm sorry, there are some people that are at this, you know, at the university for one specific reason. I want a diploma. You know the ones. I mean, they come to me and they say, just tell me what I need to know to get an A. It's not what do I need to know to become an effective person in the future, to be successful in my. No, just tell me what I need to know to get an A. And it's really hard to work with somebody that just is of this mindset. If they don't, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink, right? So clearly, training is in fact hinging upon the motivation of the people being trained. Error training. It may be effective to actually allow the trainees to get hands-on, trial and error, and actually fail a few times so that they can see not just successful performance, but also failure performance. Okay, what does it look like to fail? Okay, and so, all right, very cool. Now, training, and like we said, there's these different characteristics and principles of learning that can enhance the effectiveness of training. But what's critical is that the training that you deliver transfers into job performance. Remember, this is all about the money, okay? This is all about the money for this corporation. If I'm spending $100 on training this employee, there damn well better be some improvement in performance on the other end that that makes me more than $100, right? I mean, just that's what it comes down to. So we can talk about positive transfer and negative transfer. Positive transfer is clearly what we want, right? Training improves job performance. Negative transfer can happen. Well, hopefully we're not doing that. So instead, on this next slide, how am I going to increase the likelihood of positive transfer? Well, the identical elements theory of transfer says that the larger the similarity there is between the training situation and the job situation, the more positive transfer will happen. Huh? And so what happens is you need to have lots of practice time. And in fact, I want to show you this idea. I love this idea. This is totally outside of IO psychology, but tough luck. Here it is. This is Guthrie. This isn't Woody Guthrie. No, this is don't remember Guthrie. Oh, Edwin Ray Guthrie. Thank God. All right, this is Guthrie, and Guthrie had this notion he called one trial learning, and one trial learning is the idea that learning occurs in one shot. So we think, oh, the more you practice, the better you get. The more you no, says Guthrie. One shot. All learning occurs in one trial. Okay, and so what happens is Guthrie breaks down the act of the process of learning into these three steps. He says learning requires movements, acts, and skills. Okay, and so let's say, for example, the skill of golf, the largest component, the skill requires many acts. The acts of putting, the acts of driving, the acts of, I don't know, sand trap playing. I don't know what to call it. Okay. But it turns out that the act of, just pick putting, the act of putting requires many movements. Because what happens is, I've golfed a few times. It was embarrassing, so it's enough to know what golfing is, right? And so I know that if you're putting on a slope, it's a different set of movement. In order to perform the act of putting successfully, the specific movements will be quite different depending on the exact situations. But if you take and let's say a 3-foot putt on a 20-degree slope, and you do it successfully, boom, you have one trial learned how to make a 3-foot putt on a 20-degree angle. Okay? Well, the next time you go to putt, inevitably, it's going to be a different movement required for the successful act of putting. And so what Guthrie said was, each and every time that you successfully complete a putt, you have learned a specific movement. It looks like practice leads to increases in learning simply because it is this bringing together of all of these movements required to successfully perform the act looks like, and the acts need to improve to come back together on the skill, but ultimately each movement is a one trial process. So the idea is that the more practice you can give your employees during training in more situations, more specifics, and so all of a sudden, because what happens is that when you're actually performing your job, it's not always exactly the same situation. So if you take your training and you do it in all kinds of different settings with different combinations with lighting conditions and different kinds of speed of the assembly line, I don't even know what it's going to be, but the more different scenarios that you train your participants in, the more movements will be learned, and therefore the skills required for job performance will improve. Okay, so that's a pretty good one. I like that. Yeah, there it is. And then finally, there was a meta-analysis done on this positive transfer, and what they found was that people that have higher cognitive ability, higher conscientiousness, and were voluntarily participating were more likely to have positive transfer of training. That the social support was related to. So those trainees that had social support were more likely to have positive transfer. And post-training self-efficacy and post-training, no, I don't even know what that means. Okay, but the point is that there are particular factors which can predict how much positive transfer of training will occur. All right, we'll stop it for here and we'll come back next time and talk about methods of training. Okay?